Hello everyone, a new educational chess game. I'm going to play the pawn to d4. Let's see where that takes us. My opponent plays d5, and now I'm going to play not the London system, but the caller system, which involves playing e3 right away. In the London system, you bring out the bishop before playing e3. But in the system call, the bishop will have a different purpose. We'll see that a bit later. Knight f3 is played. If he brings out his bishop from the white square to f5 or g4, I'm going to start attacking his central pawn with the move c4. And then follow up with queen b3 to attack the b7 pawn, which the bishop will no longer be protecting. But that's not what he does. He plays the knight to c6. Normally you would expect c5 before playing the knight to c6, because here he's blocking his c pawn. Yet the c pawn can have an offensive role, or a defensive one for that matter. Either to defend the central pawn or to go on the attack against the opponent's central pawn. So here, I'm still going to adapt to the situation and play c4, since he's blocking his pawn c. I send my own pawn c to attack his central pawn. And I want to follow up with knight c3, putting pressure on d5. Then certainly bishop d3 and the push to e4, which will also free my own dark-squared bishop. But he plays bishop g4. And this is where I'm going to consider a move like queen b3 to counterattack on the pawn b7. Let's calculate queen b3. He can take the knight, I take b7 and attack his knight. That's interesting. But then he can play knight a5 and attack my queen. And look, I can't play. Queen b5 check, because he'll be able to play. c6, the knight will protect the pawn and the queen will protect the knight. So my queen will be under attack, and I won't have taken back his bishop. So queen b3, bishop takes knight. Actually, queen takes b7 does not work. But on the other hand, maybe I could take back his bishop before trying to fight on the white squares. So I'm hesitating. Between knight c3, a normal developing move, or queen b3 here. I'm going to play queen b3. I still want to test him with this attack on the pawn on b7. I'm aware that he can give up the pair of bishops, meaning give up the bishop on the white square to double my pawns. But I'm starting the fight on the white square against the b7 pawn, against the d5 pawn. And I hope to use this diagonal and maybe sometimes that one. So we're going to have this imbalance. And that's why I'm not going to take on b7 right away, because of knight f5. You see, and if I go for it, queen b.5 check, c6, the pawn is protected by the knight is protected by the queen, and the queen protects the rook. Everything is protected. So I'm going to take back his bishop. Yes, for now I have a somewhat weakened pawn structure on the king side with doubled pawns and an isolated pawn, but I have the pair of bishops. I need to manage to get into a fight with the bishop he doesn't have, the white square bishop. He plays knight a5. So after queen b5, check c6, and everything is protected. I'm thinking about making a move. Queen a4 check. He's going to play c6 to protect his knight, then it'll be my turn to play. So let's play queen to a4 check. He brings his knight back to c6. He didn't want to play the pawn to c6. So now I'm interested in capturing on d5. If he recaptures with the queen, knight to c3 to develop and attack his queen, but he could take the pawn on f3, attacking my rook. That's unpleasant. So I might also want to play bishop g2, for example, preparing kingside castling. With the push to f4, I'll have a pawn structure that holds the dark squares well to fight against those knights without a dark square bishop, and I'll open the diagonal for my light square bishop. Even though I'm well aware that he'll play e6 at some point to free himself, but I'll still have moves like knight c3. Or I could start with knight c3. If he takes, my bishop recaptures and I'll look to play. Bishop b5. Maybe knight c3. I'll start with knight c3, why not? I keep putting pressure on d5. He'll probably play. e6, opening the dark square bishop and protecting the d5 pawn. And here, if I take, it's more like earlier. He can't take with the queen. So if I take, in my opinion, he'll recapture with the pawn. And then bishop b5. And the exchange of my bishop for the knight, for example, if I play queen d6, I could take his knight. If he recaptures, I take again, he recaptures. And I'll create doubled pawns for him. You might say I have my own doubled as well. But there's a difference, which is that this file is semi-open. It's open for me, not for him. So that means I could put my rooks to attack those isolated pawns, Whereas on the f file, since he has the f pawn, he can't target my pawns with his rooks. And also, I could play f4 and eventually defend them. So here, I'm hesitating. You see, I'm hesitating between taking on d5, followed by bishop b5, or putting the bishop on g to f4 and having some action on that diagonal. Even moves like bishop to b5, you have to consider them. All right, I'm going to take on d5. I'll choose the fastest approach. There, he recaptured with the pawn. Bishop b5. Now he has to come and defend with the queen. He doesn't have a choice. I take his knight with check to create pawn weaknesses. So he recaptures with the queen, so I exchange the queens here. And now my goal is to attack these two pawns. I think I'll play knight a4 first, to control the square c5, and so he can't. Get rid of that c pawn. So I go to a4. If he plays bishop b4, check, bishop d2. And if he takes my bishop, king recaptures. It's not a problem to be out of castling. We're in the endgame. I don't need to find a specific shelter. There's no queen left on the other side. The strongest piece is gone. So, knight to f4. I come to control the square c5, the blocking square for these doubled pawns. And you see I have this semi-open attacking file. He plays bishop b4 very quickly, but bishop d2. I'm not against exchanging the bishops. Anyway, my bishop wasn't doing anything. And now I have the rooks connected, which are going to be placed on the c file. And you see, he has no way to attack my weak pawns. The isolated pawn on h2 or the doubled pawn on f3, anyway, I could play f4 if it were attacked. But I don't want to push it forward because I don't want to give that square to the black knight. So now we're going to start putting the rooks on the file. If he puts the rooks on the b file, the knight defends, and then I can play b3. And if he puts the rooks on the e file, the e3 pawn is defended by the f2 pawn. So you see, on this file, he doesn't have the square for his knight, but I have the square for mine. The rooks are not targeting a weak pawn because the f2 pawn is defending, whereas my rooks are targeting weak pawns in his position. So the opening of the semi-open files and the structural changes have worked to my advantage. Now I have a highly favorable endgame, an endgame in which I can target the pawns, and if I win some, when I have won some pawns, I will have pawn majorities, and I will try to advance them to create a passed pawn. And the passed pawn could eventually become a queen. Or he will try to block it with his pieces, but I also have pieces to unblock it. So he plays knight d7, and here he leaves me the pawn c6. But in any square, could he have defended it? Well, no. So I take c6 and I attack now. c7. He plays knight b6. Here, if I take, he will recapture with the pawn, and so get rid of the weakness of the pawn on c7. So I would tend not to want to take, but my knight is under attack. So if I go back to c3, I put pressure on d5, but he can come to defend the pawn. c7, maybe with this rook or the other one. And this rook here ultimately lacks action. I'd really like it to come to the c file to double up the attacks on c7. I'm not going to play b3 because the capture will double up. My pawn's on the a file and that will ruin my structure. If I go to c5, I have to be careful because he can come to c4 and check. That's the threat. Well, listen, I'm going to take anyway. Why am I going to take? If he recaptures with the pawn a, he'll attack the pawn. A 2, I play a3, and the pawn on c7 will remain a target. If he recaptures, if he takes back with the pawn c, certainly rook d6 to go attack the isolated pawn on d5. Or rook c5 to attack it. Then afterwards, I'll have time to double the rooks on the file. I have an extra pawn and rooks that will be more active. So I'm going to go into this exchange variation. So yes, it's true that when the pawn on b6 recaptures, it controls the square c5. So I can't play rook c5, but I can play rook d6. To avoid losing his pawn, he's going to play rook d8. I'm going to exchange the rooks and then play rook c1. And so I have one more pawn and control of the open file. Of the only open file, actually. So rook d6. There you go. It's going as planned. And now the open file. When you can't get onto the 8th rank, to do back rank mate, you try to get onto the 7th rank. Because here, we're going to attack pawns that can't be defended by other pawns. And so either the rook will have to defend passively or the pawns will advance, but eventually they'll end up blocked and will become targets. Look, rook c7, I'm attacking this pawn. If he plays a5, I'll play rook b7 and the pawn on b6 will be attacked. Actually, I'm not sure. If I play rook b7, he can play rook d6. And since he gave up this escape square, rook b8 is not mate because he can escape. If I play rook c6, how will he defend the pawn? If I play rook b8, then rook d6 and the pawn d5 is lost. But on rook c6, he will play b5. But after rook c5, I'm attacking both pawns, and his rook will be unable to defend itself. So that's how we need to attack. Rook c6. In a rook endgame with an extra pawn, it's not always enough to win. But with two more pawns, it's practically always a win. There are a few exceptions, but most of the time we win. Especially since I have a king who can be active more quickly than his. Now, in endgames, that's an important factor because the king can support the advance of the pawns, for example. The problem for him isn't just losing a pawn. He might even lose another one. He's already down a pawn, he might lose a second one, and maybe even a third, because the a5 pawn will be hard to protect as well. You see here, I'm threatening rook a5 to win the pawn on a4. He comes to defend, but he loses the pawn on d5. And now I have 3 extra pawns. He attacks. If I take, he takes back. And the pawn on a2 is doomed. I could play b3, but I'm interested actually in b4, the passed pawn, which my king can come to support. And why not for my king? Come to b3, attack the pawn on a3. Now be careful because this is a game without increment, meaning there's no extra time added. So I'll have to play very quickly now. But the end game is completely won. It's quite easy to win. I can even play rook f5 now to win the pawn on a3. And now that's 4 pawns up. So he comes here, he wants to get into the position, but I'll just push my passed pawn then. The pawn on a3, I'm not in a hurry to get rid of it. There he comes to control it, but I take. Then I'll bring my king, send the other pawn. It's pretty easy to win now. I'm going to put the rook on the 7th rank to keep an eye on the g7 pawn, and I'll push the a pawn. So I can win the g7 pawn as well. I'm going to do it. I'm not going to deprive myself of that, by the way. His king has no way to break into my camp. He tries to come in, but I'll go to g6, even attack his other pawn. I'm being a bit greedy in this position. I don't need to take all his pawns, but we're having a bit of fun. When you take all your opponent's pawns, you still have to be careful about stalemate situations. That is a complete blockade that would cause a draw. All right, I'll give him a little check here. He might come back. No, he's not coming back. So I'm bringing my king closer. If he checks me, I'll push my pawn forward. Otherwise, I'll check him to force his king back. Because when the king is on its 8th rank, there will actually be risks of mate. So now I'll push the pawn to d5. I'm going to push the pawn to d6. Why? Because I want to play king b6, and I didn't want to get checked on the rank. That's why I wanted to put a pawn on d6. Because now there could have been mates, but he's trying to escape. But I send the other pawn. He won't be able to stop everything. He comes here. I send the other pawn. He has to come back now. No, he takes with check, but the pawn. How is he going to stop it? I don't see a way to stop it because if he comes here, I take with my pawn. The rook is still blocking his king's activity. And I'm threatening to promote my pawn, either to a rook or a queen, and that's mate. So he plays. Rook to 7, we're going to make the queen. I'm not going to take his rook right away. I'll check him first to take the rook with my queen. And now there are plenty of possible checks and mates. I'll choose this one, but of course there were others. I could also mate with queen e8, queen d8, queen b7, and so rook h8. There were 4 possible mates. So the computer gives me 97% accuracy versus 92% for my opponent. That's still a high accuracy score for my opponent. But you have to understand that he didn't make any big mistakes. Actually, he just got chipped away at. He lost a pawn here, a pawn there, but he didn't make any big mistakes where he lost pieces. That's why his score is still quite high, despite the gradual worsening of his position. Let's look at the opening because it's interesting for understanding the game, especially in terms of the imbalance created by exchanging the bishop for the knight. So d4, d5 was played. I play e3, he plays kf6, I play kf3, he plays kc6. Here already, this is a first point of progress. It's quite rare in queen's pawn openings to block the c-file pawn. It does happen sometimes, of course it's possible. I'm not saying it's always the square. Bad, not at all, far from it. But strategically, you do take away your ability to send the c-pawn on the attack, or even for defense. I'm taking advantage of this by playing c4. As you can see, he no longer has the move c6, so that pawn won't have any purpose for defense or offense. This c-pawn is actually deprived of play. We'll even see in the game that it will actually become a weakness. And now my opponent plays bishop g4. So first inaccuracy on my part, he blocks his c-pawn. Second inaccuracy, he brings out the bishop on the light square very quickly. But as a result, he gives me a clue to go fight on the light squares on the queen side, that is, on the side where he has abandoned the defense of the light squares. Since the bishop is no longer on c8, the pawn on b7 is more vulnerable. And I immediately take advantage of it by playing b3 and going to attack that pawn on b7. So he's going to damage my structure, bishop takes, pawn takes, but now he's going to be facing the defense of his light squares. Because after all, the weakening of my structure isn't really noticeable. In fact, it wasn't a factor in the game. He wasn't able to target my pawn structure. But my white square bishop, that's going to be a very important element. Because there's pressure on b7, pressure on d5, and the ability for this bishop of white squares to appear on b5 on the diagonal, or perhaps on g2 on the largest white diagonal on the board. That will give me a lot of play. So he plays knight a5. He's attacking my queen. I'm playing queen a4 checkmate. And he returns in c6. He refused to play the c6 pawn. He could have done it with the queen, who is defending him. And if I attack his knight, he can capture the pawn on c4. Well, what would I have done anyway? I think I would have taken on d5. I was a bit afraid of the captures by the queen, but after analyzing with the computer, no. Not at all, actually. Here you can play knight c3, attack the queen without fearing the loss of the pawn on f3. It's quite interesting to understand because after queen takes f3, you play everything on g1, the knight remains under attack, and this time it has no squares. If you want to defend it, you have to play b6, but that weakens the pawn on c6 and therefore weakens the defenses on this white diagonal and on this one. And in the end, the fact that he took the pawn on f3 will allow you to play. Bishop g2, the counterattack is devastating. I attack the queen, and after that, there will be bishop takes, check, knight takes, queen takes, check, attacking the king and the rook. The counterattack on the white squares is devastating. But in the game, after queen a4, he didn't play c6. He brought his knight back to c6. And so I played knight c3, but once again, I could have taken on d5. That's always what I was afraid of. Queen takes, which attacks the pawn on f3. I actually didn't understand in the game that you could give this pawn and that it was beneficial. Knight c3, we take the development advantage. We attack his queen. Finally, the development advantage. For now, he has 3 pieces developed. I only have 2. But above all, we're going to encourage him to take the pawn on f3. If he retreats to d7, we'll play bishop b5, just like in the game. And if he takes on f3, rook g1 to get bishop g2. And it's the same. The counterattack on the white diagonal is devastating. But I didn't understand that, and I played knight c3. So he plays e6, which seems normal. I take on d5, he recaptures with the pawn, and bishop b5. Here she comes to defend her knight with queen d6. And that's when I start to exchange the bishop for the knight to weaken his pawn structure. The computer prefers other types of moves. The computer's favorite move is e4. It's true that this activates my center under the protection of the pawn f, and now I'm even threatening the fork on e5. But I preferred to weaken his structure. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and now knight a4. I don't mind exchanging the bishops on the dark squares, mine in any square that wasn't doing much, as I told you during the game. And in this position, now the c-pawns are weaknesses. I'm not afraid of my opponent's play on the e1 file, as I said. There's the pawn on f3 that defends the e4 square and prevents infiltration. The infiltration of his knight and the f2 pawn, which defends the e3 pawn, prevents any attack. And on the b file, I have the knight defending, but I could even play b3. Whereas on the c file, the square belongs to me and the pawns will be weaknesses because they can't be defended by other pawns. So he did kingside castling. But actually the strongest move, according to the computer, which is hard to find, was knight g8. But it's hard to find such a retreat with your knight. But actually, it's to reposition it on e7 and hold the pawn on c6. The second best move for black would have been to play king to d7 to come and defend the pawn. But in any square, there would have been knight c5 check or the rooks coming onto the file. It's a white advantage, no matter what happens. But here, he did kingside castling, so he moved his king away from defending the pawns. His knight can't come back, and neither can his king, so sure, he connected the rooks, but now he's going to lose material. I played rook to c1, he went to d7, I took the pawn, he went to b6. And here, I agreed to simplify the position because I saw I was going to win another pawn. I play rook d6, so he comes to defend. He plays rook d8. I trade the rooks. I have one more pawn, but my other rook infiltrates the position. It's going to come to c7. Attack the pawn, then attack the b pawn, then attack all the pawns. You saw it. I ended up winning the pawns one by one. I gradually ate away at the position. When you're down one pawn, you can still hold on, but down two pawns, it gets tough. Then he ended up losing 3 or 4 pawns. And now, of course, it's easy to win. I hope the video was informative about this endgame transition and playing against pawn weaknesses. You can leave me likes, comments, and share the video. And we'll see each other soon for new adventures. Goodbye, everyone.